I'd like to say welcome to everybody to this ELGA Ecological Law and Governance webinar series. I'm very happy to be here with the researchers from our research group in Brazil. It's EMI, International Law and Environmental and Economic Studies. And we are going to present today a very specific topic related to our new researches. Is about the colonial theory and the human rights related to ecological law. And this is going to be recorded, and we are going. So we are happy to answer the questions, and I'd like to open the floor in the end of all the presentation. So we are going to be presenting. We are four. I'd like to quick introduce the four participants. The one is myself, Cristiane Derani. I'm part of the steering committee of ELGA, and Brazilian professor at Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, and we where we have this group. And then some of our researchers are here and going to present. First one I'd like to introduce is the Taisi Copetti. She just finished her undergrad studies and is going to talk about part of her work to finish her studies. It's multilateral treaties on the import and export of pesticides in Brazil and in the European Union through the perspective of the precautionary principle. So she, after her presentation, maybe we have to restart the Zoom, but it's not a problem at all. So because we have just 40 minutes, but after that, we are going to close and reopen at the same address. So I just beg your pardon and ask for your patience to restart it if our communication finishes. Next panelist is going to be the Professor Patricia Grazziotin, and is going to talk about her theoretical and practical work related to migration and climate change. So she is a professor on international law at the University of Passo Fundo, and also researcher of our group of advanced studies in environment and economic and international law. The last panelist is Juliana de Albuquerque Pereira, and she concludes her master's degree, and she is going to talk about a part of her master's dissertation is environmental commons and transnational corporation, the plunder of nature as a foundation of coloniality. That's it. And well, to start, I'd like to share the screen. I ask Taisi to do this, please. I'm going to present, starting the discussion. So there are different topics related to the same thing. So I'm going to talk about decarbonization process and as a movement of the colonialism process. And this is my topic, and I'd like to share my paper. So maybe it's going to be easier to go with, also because my difficulties related to to the language, and I think that if you can read with, it's going to be more comprehensible. Well, talking about climate change and a carbon society, I'd like to start highlighting that democracy, ecology, as well production and consumption process are severely threatened in our society, and they are connected by the same cause, a carbon-rooted civilization and the lack of a real social answer to this misgovernment generated by it. Geopolitical interests, biodiversity, and labor exploitation are symptoms of an agonizing society rooted in carbonized neoliberal economic logic. And what do colonialism and neocolonialism have to do with the failure of decarbonizing the global society? The answer is everything. If you go to the past, so from 1492 to 1995, with the launch of the WTO and going onwards, the economic system has been developed based on the flow of natural resources exploitation from the global south to the north. Wealth concentration due to this flow and the launch of industrial revolution, eager to an always larger consumer market. Fossil fuel energy-based economy, which principles are the expansion of production, gently expressed as progress or development, profits, natural resource exploitation in an endless growth society. And fourth, universal ethics based on a misconception of freedom that paradoxically reproduces the idea expressed by André Terre, who wrote about the savages he met in America in 1557. And I quote his conclusion. America has been inhabited by savage people without law, without faith, without any civility, living as unreasonable beasts. More than a description, it seems as it is a prediction to the contemporary global economic society, which was launched in England and refined with Fordism in America, and spread all over the world, making a globalized economics. The colonial time added to ordinary trade, the conquest of land and a parallel exploitation of people and resource, which gave it a vertiginous improvement to the old market relations, changing their content. The economic, religious, political, geopolitical structures were completely reshaped with the abundance of wealth, land, and information after European came into America. The ancient words such as market, bank, society, slavery, and state were completely reshaped after the 16th century. New institutions started to be built. Modern concepts of sovereignty brought by Baudin and slavery justified the domination and expropriation. The sovereign states were opposed to colonial and uncivilized territories, and slaves were justified by a colonial ethos of a non-human savage nature that could be exploited with no mercy, so as the natural resources. Thus, an imperial colonialist way of material and human relations was launched. and the roles were well established until our days, with a well-kept specialization of the relations of these parties, one wins and other losses, as Galeano stated in his Latin American's Open Veils. It explains that since the beginning, everything was transmuted into European capital and later North American capital and other imperialist nation that came throughout the centuries and accumulated into the power center. The land and its fruits, its rich underground mines, the men, their workforce, consumption, the natural resource and the human resource. The mode of production and the class structure were defined from the outside. A chain of successive dependence was built, and the second half of the 20th century veiled it by the misconception of global development, followed by the idea of sustainable development. The colonial relationship is so old that it was naturalized. Throughout the centuries, it assumes different appearance, which neoliberalism is most recent, sharpening the growth of inequality, political instability, and foremost, an undeniable collapse of our entire Earth's ecological system. The steam engine by Thomas Savery and James Watt enabled the Industrial Revolution, and thanks to the massive accumulation of gold, silver, and raw material, the carbon civilization of the Capitalocene began. The increase of CO2 emissions and the greenhouse effects is responsible for species extinctions, droughts, floods, food insecurity, and urban disasters all over the world. And it is clearly the cause of the changes in the Earth's biosphere. This profound change is not the result of the activities of the entire human race through time, but it is historical created because first, the increase of a greenhouse gas emission is 100 times faster than the emissions in the first half of the 19th century. Also, in the beginning of the 21st century, 7% of the richest are responsible for 50% of CO2 emissions, whereas 7% of emissions are caused by 45% of poorest. Moreover, some developed countries were responsible for 72.7% of CO2 emissions since 1850, while 2.6 billion humans barely make use of fossil energy, quoted from the Fossil Capital. Second, the fossil economy was never a species-wide project, nor a democratic endeavor. The root of climate change is shown to lie with the power of some to put the private accumulation of wealth above all else. In conclusion, the collapse of the Earth system is caused by carbon economy and marked by inequalities. Furthermore, international talks and agreements aiming to reduce the emissions and mitigate the effects of climate change preserve the inequalities and the economic system of the carbon society. The perverse strategy of this new financial market allows industrialized countries to buy the excess GHG emission permits from countries which economy is in depression, and because of the GHG emissions are likely to be much lower than their targets. Such transfers will do little or nothing to help slow global warming, though they will inevitably enrich countries' oligarchs despite the economic crisis. The result, ever-increasing carbon emissions, which in recent years have grown at around 2% per annum And in 2013, it reached a record high of 36 billion tons of CO2, some 61% above the level in 1990. My argument is that the economic instruments that intended to change behaviors through the same old market structures are not able to make the dividing economic structure responsible. Instead of calling the responsibilities for the structure, it invokes the ones who are on the top and the ones who are on the bottom of the system, giving them a chance to climb and meet the lucky ones. This ideological way of changing subjects without changing relations are the reasons of the distortion of China's increasing pollution rates, for example. This movement put aside the political sphere and replaced it for the economic environment as the financial market. The economy becomes independent of political implementation. The political sphere is called only to set up a framework and, of course, provide some subsidies. By consequence, UNFCCC is promoting a sort of carbon colonialism through its support for an establishment of international carbon trading and offsetting strategies. The inversion of the hierarchy, raising economy above nature and society, perfectly sums up the ever-accelerating commodification of nature. When economics become the policy, we have as a result, a democracy that is constructed by traits of big data, governance that is built by market interest, and sovereignty becomes the power of concentrated capital. You do not need to possess fortune-telling powers. You do not need to possess fortune-telling powers to conclude that the result of the disastrous inequalities, injustice, weakness of the political institution, and fear thrives, bringing back the homo homini lupus. This 21st century, homini lupus is also the political arm to fast-track ecological collapse. Environmental law, using economic instruments as a tool to perform correct human activities, are incapable of respecting aggregate ecological boundaries within the human Earth system. Environmental law needs a Copernican revolution over their values and principles, introducing ecology into economic theory and switching political practice back to the center of social reasoning and action. The rule of law is in charge to understand the law of nature and build a rule of law for nature within the society. Scientific knowledge, the spiritual and practical traditions of ancient cultures have to be balanced and accepted by the rule of law, which has to be ecological and earth-centered. This change requires a moral ground different from the egoistic idea of maximizing private advantages. As Latour states, we are living a deep mutation of our relationship to the world. In conclusion, the civilization utopia must be the recovery from the waste left by this fossil fuel-based economic system, the illusion of production that subjugates politics, society, and nature must be replaced by an earth-centered, social-centered rule of law, able to manage material production, spiritual and emotional welfare, as well as ecological balance. You may now doubtfully ask, is that feasible? Is that a reasonable response in this time of urgency and quick solutions? I answer quoting Galeano, utopia is on the horizon. I move to step closer, it moves to step further away. I walk another 10 steps and the horizontal runs 10 steps further away. As much as I may walk, I will never reach it. So what's the point of utopia? The point is this, to keep walking. Thank you very much. So I give the floor to Thais.
Thank you, Professor Derani. It's hard to talk after you. Good afternoon, everyone. You can hear me well? Okay. Well, my name is Taisi Copetti. I'm Bachelor in Law at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. It's a pleasure for me to be here today to talk about the research I carry out in the last 2 years undergraduate studies concerning multilateral treaties on the import and export of pesticides in Brazil and the European Union through the perspective of the precautionary principle. Since the colonial fears are the subject of this webinar, I will focus especially on the colonial relations that still exist between Brazil and European Union, which somehow still interfere in the unequal use of pesticides in these places, and also about the applicability of the precautionary principle as an argument for prohibiting the import and export of pesticides. Well, in the current capitalist perspective of agriculture mechanization, food has been transformed into a commodity, and it is produced on a large scale. Large productions, however, require large applications of pesticides. The worrying scenario surrounding the use of pesticides shows that we are facing an ecological, social, and public health problem at a global level. The international law then seeks to regulate and control these chemical substances through multilateral treaties. And in this context, the precautionary principle also presents itself as one of the legal and political instruments developed by the international community in order to manage inherent risks caused by industrial and economic development in the environment. The three multilateral treaties consider the basis of the norms that regulate the issue of chemical safety are the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, and the Stockholm Convention. The Basel Convention was adopted for the purpose of dealing with changes related to the generation, transport, handling and disposal of hazardous waste based on the notification and prior consent procedure. Basel provides three interdependent pillars, which are global control of transborder waste transport, environmentally sound management, and waste generation. But its provision and focus only on transport, showing itself more as a regulatory systems for waste transfers than a control systems itself. Moreover, the Rotterdam Convention is the instrument that deals specifically with pesticides and has proven to be the most flexible of the three multilateral treaties. This is because it does not establish measures to ban dangerous chemical substances, but seeks to promote shared responsibility between exporting and importing states. When analyzed the Rotterdam Convention, it is clear that its provision, also based on the system of prior consent, are present as a cooperation systems so that the international community has access to information about pesticides to decide sovereignty on which substances will be imported into their territories. The Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, on the other hand, deals with the production, trade, use, and final deposit of this class of substances. It proved to be the most restrictive of the three multilateral chemical safety treaties, as it stipulates prohibition and elimination measures. It is also the only one of the three conventions to address the precautionary principle to achieve the objective of protecting human health and the environment. In conclusion, there is an ability to manage in a socially and ecologically sustainable way these wastes, such as pesticides. It is evident that humanity is going through a waste crisis that is constantly intensified and that could be better managed if other pillars of the Basel Convention, for example, were put into practice. In addition, the need for cooperation between developed countries and developing countries was highlighted. Since the implementation of the conventions, it is a priority interest of developing countries, but the impacts generated by these substances are of a global nature, and it is also necessary the participation of development countries. The European Union has the most rigorous pesticide legislation in the world. Currently, it has 4 specific regulations, and it is possible to identify a more restrictive regulatory framework that occurs a result of a series of measures continually adopted so that these substances are controlled and banned from his territory. As for the numbers, there are currently 1,513 pesticides registered. Of these, only 507 have been approved and were released for use and trade. With regard to Brazil, currently it is the largest consumer of pesticides in the world in absolute numbers, and this is directly linked to the market aimed at exporting monocultures. Brazil has only one legal regulatory device which established stricter rules, but is not capable of effectively controlling the proper use of these substances. In addition, it instituted the regulatory structure through a system with specific competence attributed to federal agencies that are directly influenced by the government. As for the numbers, there are 3,477 pesticides being sold throughout Brazil. Evidently, these substances cause harm to human health and the environment. I emphasize here that there are researches that indicating deaths from poison and others aggravations, such as the development of cancer and DNA alterations. Regarding environmental damage, the effects are uncertain, as pesticides can easily reach non-target organisms. Thus, there is evidence that pesticides are found in water, in forest, or fixed for a long time in the soil and living organisms that start a chain of poison, as Rachel Carson say in her book, Silent Spring. Furthermore, it can be observed that the application of pesticides occurs disproportionately, and it affects countries and communities in different ways due to the influence of economic and political factors. These countries, we call South countries, classify as developing countries. On the other hand, countries classified as developed were called North countries. This conception of the South is the approach of the theorists of the modernity coloniality group, overlaps in part with the geographic South, that is country and regions of the world that we are subject to European colonialism, such as Brazil. I emphasize that the corporate headquarters of these companies in the global pesticide market are based in Europe. So the European Union produces pesticides, but it does not use it. them, concentrating, however, the final phase of the life cycle of pesticides they use in less developed countries in the south, together with less restrictive legislation as Brazil. This logic expressed a simple observation developed by Aníbal Quijano, that the relations of coloniality in the economic and political spheres did not cease to exist with the destruction of colonialism. On the contrary, the modern colonial logic commends the globalization process and highlights an environmental injustice based on economic development. However, this is not the only reason, because of the colonial relationship that this phenomenon occurs. The Brazilian government also enhances, as in recent years, there has been an increase in neoconservatism in the political system, which directly influence environmental policy and consequently the import of pesticides. It is also important to highlight that Brazilian public policies on the control of the use of pesticides were submitted to actions that purposely weakened the regulatory bodies, whether through the definition of budget, appointment of ministers, change of ministers. Since the beginning of the government, Jair Messias Bolsonaro, our president, published the approval of 1,411 new pesticides in a period of 3-4 years. As will be shown, the use of pesticides has been causing damage to the environment and the human health, and the precautionary principle can be presented as an argument for prohibiting the import and export of pesticides. Among the different concepts presented about the principle, I highlight that in addition to the normative text brought by Rio 92 and other conventions, precaution has a temporal dimension, as it's related to the future and also to the present, thus requiring an intervention that must necessarily change the way of development on economic activity. The precautionary principle in the translation of the search for the protection of human existence, whether for the protection of the environment or the protection of the integrity of life as a whole. So it's not only the risk that must be considered. What must be guided by the precautionary principle is a policy that aims human well-being in an ecologically balanced environment. As for the possible criteria for the prohibition of import and export of pesticides considering the precautionary view, I draw attention to the World Trade Organization, AC Biotech, and hormone case, in which the precautionary view was taken account for the verification of risk, which may open up possibilities for applying these measures in other cases. In this case, AC Biotech and hormones, the European Union was create trade barriers considering the precautionary view. This is also shown as a possibility. And at the end of my speech, I highlight the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, number 23 of 2017, in which it was recognized that environmental damage can affect all the human rights, in the sense that the full enjoyment of human rights depends on an environmental conductive. Thus, it is necessary to recognize that natural boundaries exist, independently of the preferences, values, or communities of states and human beings based on political and socioeconomic feasibility, which is what Professor Gabriel says in his studies. So planetary boundaries can help lead to an understanding of ecological integrity that takes into account the complexities of using pesticides. Finally, I emphasize that considering planetary boundaries implies something bigger, implies a socially constructed systems and norms that can radically transform legal and non-legal systems in order to promote an ecological balance human-earth relationship. It's evident that agriculture is essential to human life, and it reflects the core of human essence. However, reviewing human action in relation to pesticides is reviewing the human relationship itself, as the treats and their values will only have material applicability through the redefinition of what is important in a society, of what normative expression and of values. Awareness of the need for a healthy environment for life, and that includes our life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Taisi. It's a very important topic. When you talk about Earth, we talk about our only home. So Earth is circular, and it's incredible to think about production as a linear process. And what is worse, a linear process that you can export. You cannot export gifts, you cannot export pesticide without thinking that they are going to come back to you. So by things that you eat, or water that you drink, or even the rain you receive. So it's very important to understand it. Thank you very much for your presentation. Well, then I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Patricia Grazziotin is going to talk about migration and climate change. Please, Patricia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Derani. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to be here, join the floor with other researchers from the MI, UFSC. I'm an international law professor at the University of Passo Fundo, and I would like to share my screen. 1 minute, please. Okay, so as Professor Derani stated, I'm going to work with the connection with migration and climate change. And I'd like to present my proposal here, which is going to follow this plan. First, regarding the connection and the definitions and treaties regarding migration and climate change. Second, analyzing how the impact of the water storage is important in the climate change and affect the migration. And in the end, propose some reflections concerning the voluntary, if that migrations occurred by the climate change, if they are voluntary or forced migration, if they are temporary or permanent, and if we really have a lack of law protection for that migrants. So first, what we have from regulation and what we have for migration process. So it's important to understand the migration process in the two ways. When we talk about human migration, we talk about the movement of people from one place to another with intentions of setting permanently or temporarily at a new location. In this sense, we can consider migration as a voluntary, is based on initiative and the free will of the persons, and they influenced by a combination of factors, economic, political, and social. When you talk about forced migration, we are talking about refugees. and why it's important to understand what is a voluntary migration and what is a forced migration. Because voluntary migration, people move in a free will, and they are not protected by documents, by international documents, which could be conventions or treaties regarding. They are going to be part in another state and be suggested by domestic law in each country. When we talk about refugees, we have a convention, an important convention, which is called the Convention Relating the Status of Refugees, called also the Geneva Convention of 1951. And if we have a look in this timeline, we can see how the forced migration is connected with climate change. And first, we have to begin in the first document, which state who are a refugee. And as a result of the events occurring before the 1st January 1951, it's understood as an event who people who was being prosecuted for reason of race, religion, nationality, membership or particular social group or political opinion. It's outside of the country of its nationality and unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence as a result of such events, is unable or owing to such fear is unwilling to return it. So this is the concept of refugees, and these events, protection in the Geneva Convention is regarding the events occurring in Europe after the Second War. After that, we have the 1967 protocol relating the status of refugee, who turned make proposal to cut this part of this temporary time of the protection of the refugee regarding the events of the Second World War. Then we came to the first declaration of protection of environment. So in 1972, Stockholm Declaration of Human Environment. If we begin with the first principle, man has the fundamental right to freedom, equality, and adequate conditions of life in an environment of a quality that permits a life of dignity and a well-being. That is all climate environmental migrants are seeking to survive. And the second, in the middle of these 20 years, and from Stockholm Declaration to the Rio Declaration, we have a document proposed by Ihsan El-Hinani by the United Nations Environmental Program, who definite the environmental refugee. In this paper, what we can consider as environmental refugees as people who have been forced to leave their traditional habitat temporarily or permanently because of environmental disruption, natural and or triggered by people that jeopardize their existence and or seriously affected the quality of their life. By environmental disruption, these definitions mean any physical, chemical, and or biological change in the ecosystem, or that render it temporarily or permanently unsuitable to support human life. So if I have a look in this concept, you can see that we consider temporarily or permanently, but we are in 1985. When we arrived in the Rio Declaration and also in the United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change, the United Nations Convention on Climate Change consider a climate as a common concern of humankind. And the Rio Declaration, also in the first principle, consider that human beings are the center of concerns of sustainable development. They are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature. When people do not have guarantee to this harmony with nature, what they are going to do? They are allowed to search healthy and productive life in harmony with nature in another place. So in 2007, the International Organization for Migration has another definition of environmental migrant. What is important to say that International Organization of Migration it's a United Nations organization which protect all the migrants, even permanent and also voluntary migration. I mean, forced and voluntary migration. And in this concept of the International Organization of Migration, environmental migrants are person or group of persons who predominantly, for reason of sudden or progressive change in the environment that adversely affects their lives or living conditions, are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within their country or abroad. In this concept, we can also highlight that the International Organization of Migration consider also temporarily or permanently migration, and that migration regarding the environmental causes could be also abroad or inside the country. Then we arrived to the 2010 in the COP 16 in the Conference of the Parties who held in Cancun, and we have a very important point to consider here in the second point: enhance action on adaptation. In the paragraph 14, invites all parties to enhance action on adaptation under the Cancun Adaptation Framework, taking into account their common but different responsibilities, respective capabilities, and the specific national and regional development priorities, objectives, and circumstances by undertaking the following. Letter F, measures to enhance understanding, coordination, and cooperation with regard to the climate change, induced displacement, migration, and planned relocation where appropriate at the national, regional, and international level. So if you have a look in the timeline, we have the connections in the migration process and the climate change inside the COP 16 in 2010. Also, it's important to consider the soft law regulation about migration and climate change. And in this timeline, we can see 3 documents that we are going to have a look now. So in the regional sphere, we have the Cartagena Declaration, who would start to enlarge the concept of a refugee, bearing in mind as far as appropriate and in the light of the situation prevailing in the region, but taking into account as a precedent the Organization of African Union Convention in the Article 1, Paragraph 2, who was the first time to enlarge this concept, including in this consideration as a refugee people who also is suffering or threatened by generalized violence, foreign aggression, internal conflicts, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances which have seriously disturbed public order. So this here we have, for the second time, first in the African Convention, the enlarge of the concept of the refugees. Then we arrive to the New York Declaration. This is the first step to the next one, to have the document to Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. And here we have the real connection in three objective states in this document, connecting climate change and migration. The first objective is number 2, minimize the adverse drivers and structural factors that compel people to leave their country of origin: natural disaster, the diverse effects of climate change, and environment degradation. The objective 5, enhance availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. Letter H, cooperate to identify, development, and strengthen solutions for migrants compelled to leave their countries of origin owing to slow onset natural disasters, the adverse effects of climate change and environmental degradation, such as desertification, land degradation, drought, and sea level rise, including by devising planned relocation and visa option in cases where adaptation in the return to their countries of origin is not possible. It's also important to say that in the objective number 23, we have also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, connecting also another impacts as poverty, unemployment, climate change and disasters, inequality, corruption, and poor governance, among other structural factors through appropriate cooperation frameworks. So here we arrived to a document. We have the connection of migrants, migration, and if we can consider this document, the regular migration, we consider migration as all. If we pay attention, these three objectives, we don't have any distinction of the as a kind of migration, and also if they are temporarily or permanently. So I think the important document that we have now is the 2018 Conference of the Parties, the COP24, which have from reconnection to action, climate change, and human mobility. And here we jump for reaching an action to protect the people who want to migrate, who want to move to another country, and who has to move, regarding that there is no form or no way to survive, considering the effects caused by the climate change. And moving to my second part of my presentation, I just like to consider some the impacts of the climate change and water storage and the migration. So why water is important in the middle of these two topics, why water can deal with these two topics. If we consider the water scarcity, aridity, food insecurity, the sea level rise, and the disasters, we can see in this graphic. Let me do less here to see all. We can see in this report from the United Nations University Institute for Water and Environment, how water can interfere how climate change can interfere in the water quality, water quantity, and water extremes, and also make people move from the place that they are living. So water quality is regarding the groundwater contamination, surface water pollution, lack of water management. Water extremes, we are talking about water again, floods without rain, droughts, sea level rise, and water quantity, we are talking about increasing aridity, increasing use, lack of access. And all these this consideration can make people move from their home. Here we have two figures to look out in 2005 and 2019. So in the report of the WMO Weather Mundial Organization, we have just in the period of January and June of 2019, more than 6.7 million new internal disaster displacement, and this is caused by cyclones, hurricanes, and flooding, which make people move from their homes. It's a shame that I couldn't share the web presentation, but because here we can see how the aerial sea decrease in this period. So the reduction, and we can follow the reduction of the aerial sea, and also we can this cause a displacement of 10,000 of people due to the drought. And also the shade lake, which also decrease and make 2.5 million people migrate in the last decade. Also to think about the World Water Week, which was in August, that this factor is we cannot disconnect water, climate change, and migration, and because without water people cannot survive, and we can consider that the effects of climate change in the water quality, quantity, and availability. Arriving to my final remarks, what we would like to propose here is to think about it's really forced or voluntary migration. In my point of view, we are talking about forced migration. Why? Because people can survive without water. People cannot survive in a country as Haiti, which had an earthquake and make them to move searching for a better life. We are talking about temporary migration. I don't believe the environment cannot be recovered. We can't get the lake. There is not there is not there anymore. So which make people migrate for permanent and not temporarily. Lack of digital protection, I don't believe. We have a lot of instruments that we can base on migration and climate change. And common concern of humankind, Earth is shouting, and people are moving, searching for a better life caused by climate change. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Patricia, for your wonderful presentation and very well illustrated, and some images speaks for themselves, and I think it is a concern of all people in this world, again, we have just one home. We are all together. We are all connected. So globalization is not an economic globalization. It is a social environment and harming globalization. So I'd like to give the floor to our last speaker. I'll give the floor to Juliana de Albuquerque Pereira, who's going to speak about environmental commons and transnational corporations, the plunder of nature as a foundation of coloniality. Thank you, Juliana. You have the floor.
Hi, everyone. I would like to thank you guys to stay until now, and I'll begin my presentation. So my name is Juliana Pereira. I'm a professor of environmental law. I have a master's degree in international law and sustainability from the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and I am a researcher at MI. So today I would like to talk to you about the connections between transnational corporations, the plunder of the commons, and colonialism. So for didactic purposes, I intend to divide my speech in three main parts. To start with, we'll be focusing on the concept of environmental commons. In the second part, we'll be talking about how these environmental commons have been constantly plundered throughout history, and especially by transnational corporations, even before these corporations had the configuration that they have today. Finally, in a third moment, we'll explain the correlation between this plunder of nature and the foundation and maintenance of the colonial matrix of power. Okay, so what are the environmental commons? Well, the common subject is quite extensive. So this concept varies according to the approach adopted. We have, for example, the medieval notion of commons, the institutional perspective of commons, the international law approach of commons, and so on. Originally, the term commons referred to communal lands cultivated and used in common by peasants in medieval Europe. Modernly, the International Association of the Study of the Commons states that the term is used generically to refer to a series of natural and cultural resources that are shared by different people. So, from a contemporary perspective, the term commons does not just refer to natural resources. It is also used to refer to several other domains such as knowledge commons, urban commons, cultural commons, and so on. For the institutional perspective, for example, mainly researched by Elinor Ostrom, the commons are understood as institutional arrangements. This approach seeks to demonstrate, in the case of Ostrom's research, how collective management can be the only way to really preserve a certain common good. In the institutional context, the commons necessarily presuppose a social arrangement linked to it. Well, there is another part of the literature that gives the commons a more political approach. For the authors of this approach, such as Dardot and Laval, the common, in singular, is related to a diversity of movements, struggles, practices, and ways of living around the globe that, in one way or another, face up to the attempt at destruction and the destruction of these commons. So, the list of struggles for the commons that this approach encompasses. In this list, we have environmental movements, anti-globalization movements, movements against privatization of public goods, and other counter-hegemonic struggles. Well, there are also many references in literature to the global commons, mainly in international law, to which these global commons are those natural resources that are not within the jurisdiction of any particular state, and to which, at least in theory, all nations have access, such as the high seas, the atmosphere, the Antarctica, and the space. It is also usual to find in literature terms like global public goods, common heritage of mankind, and so on. So, after a lot of research which encompassed not only these notions of commons that I just mentioned, we came up with the concept of environmental commons. So for us, what are these environmental commons? Well, we consider that the environmental commons encompasses the natural resources alone and the natural resources plus a community that manages it in common, manages the natural resource in common. In conclusion, our concept of environmental commons tends to be kind of broad. Okay, now that we have established the concept of environmental common, we're going to the second part of this talk, where we'll briefly explain the process of plundering that these environmental commons suffered throughout history. So, first of all, what we need to know is that the plunder of nature is an observable phenomenon from the pre-capitalist conjuncture to the present day. This happens mainly through process of privatization and commodification of resources that belong to a community or to all of us, and also through the dismantling of a culture based on commony for the implementation of a market-based logic of production. All of this can be made legally or not. We can say that the most evident historical root of this process were the medieval enclosures that started around the end of the 15th century. Briefly, medieval enclosures, which are widely documented in literature, were enclosures processes through which feudal lords and nobility approached pastures, forests, appropriated pastures, forests, and water that were collectively used by peasants. In this process, the peasants who depended on the commons to obtain firewood, cultivate vegetables, and so on, could no longer use them. So they migrated to the cities where the Industrial Revolution later emerged. There, they were either enslaved in factories or became beggars. The medieval enclosures were part of the so-called primitive accumulation, which was an essential condition for the birth of capitalism. Primitive accumulation was this massive and violent accumulation of capital that created the necessary conditions for the development of capitalism. Obviously, these enclosures were not carried out by transnational companies, at least not as we know them today, but they were fundamental to create the conditions for the development of the system in which transnational corporations were born and developed, and from which they later became master representatives. Along with medieval English enclosures, colonial exploitation in America and Africa also began, with the mass enslavement of their original peoples. Okay, according to Marx, the discovery of the gold in Argentine lands in America, the extermination, enslavement, and burial of the native population in the mines, the beginning of the conquest and sacking of the East Indies, the transformation of Africa into a reserve of the commercial hunting of Black people, they also characterize the dawn of the era of capitalism production. This process constitutes fundamental moments of the primitive accumulation. So several authors identified that the foundation of modernity and coloniality lies in the discovery and invention of America. It was in this process that America, according to Dussel, became the first periphery on the world system. According to Silvia Federici, the biggest process of privatization and land enclosure occurred in America. Excuse me. So, according to Silvia Federici, the biggest process of privatization and land enclosure occurred in America continent, where in the beginning of the 17th century, the Spaniards had already appropriated at least 1/3 of the indigenous communal lands. We have to keep in mind that this process was carried out by colonial companies such as English East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, and a lot others. Most of them being founded in the beginning of the 17th century and many of them functioning until the mid-19th century. So colonial companies were the first companies to expand productive activities beyond state borders, being at their time the most similar thing that we have to the modern transnational corporations. But these colonial companies were not private. They were state arms that accumulated a lot of state functions relating to the administration and exploitation of the colonies. They had their own flags. They were invested with authority, not only to sell products, but also to organize colonized endeavors and to administer the colonies with the military support of their own armies. All this accumulation of capital was seen by Marx as a process that would end as soon as capitalism was established. In other words, from then on, the accumulation of capital would take place through surplus value and not necessarily through the plunder of nature. However, later in the work, Accumulation of Capital, study on the economic interpretation of imperialism, Rosa Luxemburgo identified that this process of plundering would not cease. It has not ceased up until today. Rosa Luxemburgo realized that this continuous expansion of capitalism towards individuals, cultures, and collectivities, not yet integrated in the capital reproduction system, was necessary for the system's very existence and reproduction. Rosa Luxemburgo's biggest insight was realizing that as long as the system is standing, the plunder will also be. And here lies the point. This perception of the system is essential for us to understand how and why the transnational corporations continue to this day to appropriate portions of nature and communal arrangements that remained outside their logic. Developing Rosa Luxemburgo's theory, David Harvey identified that whenever the system presents a crisis of overaccumulation of capital, that is, whenever profitable investment opportunities are lacking, a new round of enclosures, such as it happens after the 1973 oil crisis and after the 2008 financial crisis, occurs. Harvard claims that as capitalism has been experiencing chronic difficulties of overaccumulation since 1973, what is left for it is the privatization of everything. And this is where transnational companies, as we know them today, come in. These companies, at least since the second half of the 21st century, especially from the 80s onwards, with the advance of the neoliberal agenda, were able to spread around the world without major legal ties. International economic institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and the WTO played mainly in the 80s and the 90s an essential role in the dissemination and implementation of neoliberal guidelines around the world, which enabled the global expansion of transnational corporations. From then on, these companies intruded in peripheral countries of the world system and were free to plunder nature and dismantle communal ways of life without being harassed by any ties, which is the reason why they now have enormous economic and political power. If transnational corporations are now considered the main modern instrument of foreign control domination of natural resources, is mainly because of this process. This entire process, which began in the second half of the 70s, for some authors, constituted a third wave of enclosures. According to these authors, the new enclosures operated basically like the old ones, that is, by ending communal control of livelihoods, but also through new mechanisms. In these new enclosures, the entire human environment is affected, as these practices range from the dispossession of natural commons to austerity policies, including the suppression of social rights, the privatization of public spaces, and the extreme atomization and individualization of human subjectivity. The result of these new enclosures was the expulsion of millions of people from their lands and homes as a result of impositions by the IMF, mainly in Africa and Latin America. More recently, in the 21st century, this plundering of nature by large corporations can be seen in the phenomenon known in literature as global land grabbing. Global land grabbing has been a global trend observed since 2008 in response to the financial crisis, which consisted of the exponential increase in land enclosures in the world by acquisitions and, above all, by long-term leases, especially in the global south, that is, Sub-Saharan Africa, Indonesia, Philippines, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and so on. This land grabbing process has been largely encouraged by World Bank and the IMF through their reports of finance and investments. It is estimated, for example, that between 2008 and 2009 alone, 56 million hectares of land were traded globally, in contrast to the average of 4 million hectares annually traded before 2008, with 70% of all these transitions taking place in Africa. One of the reasons for this boom was that the global anticipation of possible food insecurity encouraged corporations to invest in food cultivation. Furthermore, the volatility of the fuel prices has led to widespread fear of loss of energy sovereignty. This made the spotlight turn to biofuels, which are an alternative to fossil fuels and represent a new niche of activity and profitability for the industrial agricultural sector. So in this process of global land grabbing, land that were formerly being used by small farmers for their own food needs is converted into plantations and crop monocultures. Some land is also used by forestry plantations, used to offset carbon emissions in the rich countries. So another reason for the emergence of this new enclosures, this land grabbing, is the new environmental protection mechanisms that promote, under the banner of environmental protection, accumulation through land acquisitions, resulting in the phenomenon of green land grabbing, which is also very documented in the literature. Although, according to Harvey, these new waves of enclosures, these modern enclosures, have some entirely new mechanisms of action, such as those operated through the financial market. We can see that, at least in Latin America, the classic ways of plundering the environmental commons have never been put aside, and in fact are deepening. So extractive activities never cease with the end of colonial administration in America. And it is in this relation between colonialism and the plunder of environmental commons that I would like to focus in the third and last part of my talk. Well, first of all, it is necessary to differentiate between colonialism and coloniality. The term colonialism refers to colonial situations which presuppose the existence of a colonial administration in the classical modes. The term coloniality, on the other hand, designates colonial situations that remain in the present time, even in the absence of a colonial administration. Aníbal Quijano coined the term coloniality of power to refer to the relations of coloniality in the economic and political spheres that did not end with the destruction of colonialism, like Taisi said. This idea of coloniality of power was extended to other spheres. In other words, According to Walter Mignolo, this colonial matrix of power is a complex structure, which is reproduced in a triple dimension: coloniality of power, coloniality of knowledge, and coloniality of being. Thus, the colonial administration leaves, but its power relations remains. Colonizers continue, now much through the international market and through the action of large transnational corporations, to exert influence on the economy, knowledge, politics, subjectivity, and in the administration of natural resources, which continue to be target of plunder. Colonized countries continue to occupy a subordinate position in the world system described by Wallerstein. As a rule, they continue to play the role of commodity exporters and to be a source of cheap labor in the international division of labor. It is no coincidence that one of the most striking characteristics of the modern transnational companies is the transfer of socially and environmentally harmful activities to the global south, as Naomi Klein announced in her book No Logo. One of the many problems arising from this is that an equal exchange, that is, at the end of it's an equal exchange. And an equal exchange is that happens when, at the end of the trade balance, the transfer of capital from the so-called poor countries to the rich are bigger than that ones from the rich countries. There is one of the reasons why foreign investments often do not bring the promised development. This is because, in practice, these investments aim the inclusion of territories to the circuits of capital accumulation. They aim the transformation of populations into consumers. They aim the transformation of subsistence farmers into workers. They aim the transformation of natural goods into commodities. And they aim the transformation of collective property into private and saleable property. This is all following the accumulation by dispossession logic that I just talked about. And all of this can only happen until today because there is a direct and an indirect political interference by transnational companies in the governments of former colonies. In Latin America, transnational corporations have a long history of incompatibility with democratic governments and of supporting authoritarian regimes. In fact, the participation of transnational corporations, mainly the extractive ones, in the coup d'etat carried out in Latin America in the 60s and in the 70s is well documented in the literature. The socialist-oriented governments that were proliferating in Latin America at the time represented a direct threat to the companies operating in those countries, due, for example, to the nationalization of these companies, as occurred in the case of Allende in Chile. So, political interference is just one of the ways in which transnational corporations perpetuate colonial power relations. But it is through political interference and economical power that these transnational corporations manage to interfere in other dimensions such as nature and social relations, violating in this process several human rights. A clear example of this is mining. Mining is a colonizing activity par excellence. It has always been at the epicenter of colonial exploitation and continues to this day, even with more disastrous methods. As an example, it is estimated that today at least 20% of Peru's territory, about 26 million hectares, is under concession for mining. And for those concessions to take place, they are usually preceded by a process of regulation of land title, which means in practice privatization of common use lands and forcibly expropriating farmers and indigenous populations. So, to summarize, in short, when transnational corporations dismantle commonly based social arrangements to economically exploit the environmental resources, they reinforce the colonial matrix of power in all its dimensions. When transnational companies invest in commodities in former colonies, maintaining the international division of labor, reinforcing the subordinate role of the global south in the world macroeconomics, and contributing to an equal exchange, they reinforce the colonial matrix of power. When transnational corporations, along with international financial institutions, promote neoliberal guidelines, austerity policies, and privatizations around the world, they reinforce the colonial matrix of power. When transnational corporations threaten the democratic process of countries in the global south and support coup d'etat as they did in the 60s and the 70s, they reinforce the colonial matrix of power. When transnational corporations lobby for flexibilization in environmental and labor standards, they reinforce the colonial matrix of power. When transnational corporations dismantle social ties and force the disappearance of other ways of life, imposing hegemonically the same way of life for the whole world, they reinforce the colonial matrix of power. And above all, when transnational corporations, in order to carry out all these processes, largely violate human rights, they guarantee the maintenance of the colonial matrix of power in absolutely all its dimensions. Well, that's what I had to talk to you guys today. I apologize because I think it was a little bit too long, but I thank you for staying and listening to the end. And now I'll hand over to Professor Derani. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juliana. I think your speech closed very well the message we want to share today. And I'm just sorry not to have time to question and answer, but we do have a place on ELGA website. So people, please be free to send your questions and commentaries directly on the ELGA website, and we are going to be happy to answer you. I think I want that we stress more and more this relationship between ecological law and governance and the decolonial thought. I think it is the way, is the best way we have to implement an ecological thought and to transform the environmental structure that also is part of this rooted colonial thought. It's very difficult to change things that are alive for 500 years. But one thing is important. We must understand history. We must see history, and we see this history as all of you showed us. We can understand well this movement, and it becomes simple somehow to find a way out of this repetition of a relationship in the world. We must do this because it's the only way we have to survive and to live somehow in harmony with our planet and with our humanity. So I just want to say before I finish about the next webinar in November 16. So please take note. November 16 on circular economy, hosted by the University of Siena. It's going to be the next ELGA webinar. I thank you all for being here and participating, especially I like to thank Catherine, always there, promoting the seminars and supporting us and pushing us during this difficult time. We have the feeling somehow to be together despite all this difficulties we are living. And also thank you, Jeffrey. I just want to see you again and soon, especially maybe in Brazil, and sharing our research and doing that together as we are already doing. Thank you very much for all the assistance, and I wish you a good afternoon. Bye.
Bye.
Obrigado.
Obrigada.
Obrigada.
Obrigada.